for more, we can speak to Alexandra Filippenko, a political analyst, joining us from Vilnius. Hello to you, Alexandra. On the one hand, we have Ukraine's president saying morale is low, that there are not enough troops. On the other hand, we have Vladimir Putin, who says he just wants to create a buffer zone. Given these public declarations from Ukraine's president, is there a risk that Russia might try to push further into Ukraine rather than just creating a buffer zone?
It seems like Russia wants to push further because, of course, President Putin many times have said that Russia has no plans to take Ukrainian cities. At the beginning of the war, just a day before the war started, President Putin, the full-scale invasion started in 2022, President Putin said that Russia has no plans to take Ukrainian territory. It only wants to free some territory on the eastern part of Ukraine. So now President Putin is saying that Russia has no plans to take Kharkiv as of today. That's what he said when he was in Beijing. So maybe we should take note of that as of today. They really want to create this so-called buffer zone, or as they call it, sanitary zone, in response to the shelling of Belgorod region, Russian city of Belgorod, by the Ukrainian armed forces. But if Russia can move forward, most probably they will take this opportunity to move forward, especially since in that exact interview, President Zelensky said that now Ukraine only has about 25% of what Ukraine needs to defend its territory. So Russia knows it, and if Russia knows it, probably they will try to push forward.
Yeah, and if Ukraine is outgunned and outmanned, what can it do to try to slow the Russian advance?
First of all, Ukraine needs the help of Western allies, of course, that help from the United States, and they need it as fast as possible in order to stop Russian offensive. Of course, also one of the opportunities are talks with the Russian side. But we know that President Putin, also in that interview while his trip to China, he said that the Istanbul agreements must be the basis for negotiation process on Ukraine, and that Russia, according to President Putin, is ready for negotiations. And according, again, to President Putin, the attempt to inflict a strategic defeat on the battlefield is failing. So Russia will not tolerate an attempt to impose an ultimatum or something that how Ukraine sees the end of the war. But as we know, Russian president has said and repeatedly said that they will not move out of the territory that they consider to be Russian territory, even those new regions that are, according to this new Russian constitution, are a part of a Russian territory. And of course, for Ukraine, for Vladimir Zelensky, and for Ukrainian officials, those territories, including Crimea, including Donbas region, are officially Ukrainian territory. That is, of course, and it's accepted by the international community. So maybe a way to move forward is to sit down and talk. But now I don't see any way of sitting down at the table, because two sides see the end of the war in absolutely different ways.
Yeah, and when you listen to Ukrainian troops on the front line, they're desperate for help to arrive as quickly as possible. There's this new mobilization law going into effect today. Do you think it'll make any changes? And when would those changes be visible on the battlefield?
Of course, we must see some changes. Not necessarily we will see them soon. President Zelensky signed this new decree on mobilization, and a decree on mobilization of convicts also, what we've been seeing in Russia also. Now, there's big difference. In Ukraine, only some categories of convicts and prisoners in Ukraine will be able to voluntarily go and serve in the army, only during martial law. And eligible are only those who have committed offenses of light and medium severity, and those who have no more than 3 years left before the end of their sentence. It is a big difference in comparison to Russia, because we are seeing on Russian front lines that those who are going to fight for Russia, those convicts, those Russian convicts, are those who are supposed to be in prison for 10 or more than 10 years. So those prisoners, if they agree to sign a contract, Ukrainian Justice Ministry said earlier that there will be potentially 10,000 to 20,000 convicts in Ukraine who could be mobilized for that contract service, but probably we will see them only around autumn, because again, in comparison to Russia, there is big difference. They can be granted parole, but final decision can only be made by the court. In Russia, prisoners sign a contract and they go to the front lines. In Ukraine, this won't work this way.
In that interview, the Ukrainian president also repeated pleas to have the West send air defense fighter jets, something he's made many calls for, and yet his allies abroad dragging their feet on that. Do you think they're going to get any closer to maybe offering that kind of help as Russia makes this push, and possibly, as Zelensky said, maybe even a second wave?
There are possibilities of a few waves of Russian offensive, and of course, Ukraine needs that help, any kind of help that Ukraine can get. But it looks like European leaders are now moving more towards the idea of a ceasefire, or more towards the idea of somehow coming to the table and negotiating. So it looks like they will push more in that side, and but at the same time, in order not to let Ukraine lose, of course, they must give more help to Ukraine. As of now, as we've already said, only 25% of the American help arrived in Ukraine. So maybe as more arrives, Ukraine will feel stronger, and there will be more opportunities and more possibilities to stop Russian offensive. And so that's how maybe Ukraine will not need that much help from the European allies.
Major NATO anniversary coming up in a few more weeks. Do you think Vladimir Putin wants to send a big message before then?
President Putin always wants to send a big message, and I think the visit to China is, of course, that big message that President Putin wanted to send. Because if we look at the agreements that were signed in China, there was nothing serious. Everything about agriculture, something about tourism, media cooperation, nothing about military cooperation, strategic cooperation, or things like that. But if we look at the photographs, at the videos, how Russian delegation was met in Beijing and what they were doing, how long they were staying, what a huge group of Russian governmental officials was there, we can see that this is a show. This is a show, and most probably not for Russian audiences, but for European audiences, for Europeans and Americans to see that Russia and China work together. But this is actually just an act, because if we look at the pictures, yes, they are impressive, but let's look at the documents. The documents that were signed are just words. There is no exact plan, no exact plans, no exact agreements. Those agreements are not in the strategic or military field. So this, I think, that was the show that President Putin wanted to put before the anniversary and before the meeting of collective West, as Putin puts it.
Yeah, so some doubts about how deep that no limits friendship really runs. Alexandra, thank you for your time. Alexandra Filippenko speaking to us from Vilnius.